I've over the years, both in Singapore and in Malaysia, over the years, been invited by Christians and in particular Catholics to speak on interfaith issues, on interreligious dialogue. And I've also visited Friar Ruben, now Bishop Ruben, at his church in Istanbul. I take a group of students once every 2 years to Istanbul, and we have a chance to visit the church and also to engage in dialogue there. And of course, on many of these occasions, the issue of St. Francis arises, is discussed. And we are, I think, very lucky that we are living not 50 years ago, but today. So we can benefit from the occasion of 800 years, because the next time this will come will be 900 years, and I think most of us won't be here, won't be around. So I'm not going to go through the history of this, because I think we're all very familiar with it, and also Dr. Hassan has gone through some of the aspects. But what I want to talk about is what the meeting between St. Francis and Malik al-Kamil means for us. And when I say what it means for us, I don't mean in the abstract. Of course, we know what it means in the sense that it has to do with humanity, it has to do with Christians and Muslims recognizing the humanity in each other despite the religious or the theological differences. We know all of that. But in today's age, how do we translate those ideas into practice? When we say recognize the humanity in each other, what does that actually mean in terms of how we should think about each other and behave with each other? So that's really what I want to speak about. And I appreciate what Dr. Hassan was saying about the need to be critical about text, because the text doesn't always reflect reality. You know, for example, as he noted, the legal texts, some of the legal texts emphasize on the need for there to be a distinction. I'm talking about the past, of course, right? The legal texts emphasize the need for there to be a distinction between Muslims on the one hand and people of other religions. Of course, in the Middle East, the others were primarily Jews and Christians. So the legal texts emphasize the need for there to be a distinction. The way Jews and Christians dress should distinguish them from Muslims. Now, when I read those texts for the first time, you can imagine the first thing that I thought. It reminded me of Nazi Germany, where Jews had to use, had to distinguish themselves by using what do you call it? The Star of David, right? And that was quite horrifying, because I couldn't understand why or how Muslims, at least some scholars who wrote these texts, would want to make that distinction to that level, right? Of course, I take comfort in the fact that this was not the practice of the Prophet. These are not stated in the Quran, and this was not the practice of the Prophet. There are many views and ideas in legal texts by legal scholars that many Muslims disagree with, and do not only issues concerning concerning other religions, but even issues concerning Muslims. For example, there are really legal scholars who suggest that it is obligatory for Muslims to use a beard, right? But there are many Muslims, including imams, who don't have beards, right? So you have a variety of views about these issues. So it's important not only to look at legal texts, but to look at the reality, how Islam was actually practiced and how these ideas were put into practice. So as Dr. Hassan was saying, if you look at the reality, you find that it was different, that these things were not put into practice. During the Crusades, or I should say in between Crusades, when the Europeans came to Palestine, when the war was over, not all of them returned to Europe. Many of them stayed. Many of them stayed, married, particularly with so-called Oriental Christians. They stayed in Palestine or in the area that is now parts of what is now called Lebanon. They stayed, and their descendants are still there, right? So we have knowledge about the interaction between European Christians, the Crusaders, who stayed after the wars or between the wars, and therefore interacted with Muslims, right? So you had European Christians, the Crusaders, you had the Eastern Christians from different churches, and you had Jews, and you had Muslims. Now, there are a lot of interesting issues, of course, concerning the interaction between Muslims and Jews and Christians during that period. But one thing that I would like to say is, we speak about these wars as crusades. For example, it was during the 5th crusade that St. Francis went to Damietta, went to Egypt and met Sultan Malik al-Kamil. Now, it's very important for you to realize, and this has to do with difference in point of views. We use the term crusades because this was a term used by the Europeans themselves during that time. But from the 11th century, when the first crusade took place, up until the 19th century, the Muslims never used the term crusade. They never referred to these wars as crusades. Because from the point of view of the Europeans themselves, in those days, they saw it as a war of the cross between Christianity and Islam. But Muslims didn't see it that way. Therefore, they never referred to the Europeans as crusaders. The Arabic word, Hurub Salibiyah, which means the war of the cross or crusades, was only used in the 19th century. And it was the Arabic term for crusades was basically a translation of the European terms. And when Arabs, I think particularly Syrian Christians, started to translate European works into Arabic about the crusade, that's when the term crusades came into the Arabic language. But the Arabs themselves, during the crusades, referred, are you familiar with, do you remember or can you guess what the Arabs referred to or the Muslims referred to the Europeans as? What do they refer to the crusaders as? Yeah? Any idea? They refer to them as Franks. Faranj in Arabic, or Ifranj in Arabic, which is an Arabicization of Franks. They saw them as foreigners, not so much as Christians, but as foreigners. And I'm saying this to give you an idea of what was in the minds of Muslims, right? So in the minds of Muslims, in Palestine, Muslims were living alongside Jews and Christians. And it was also Christian, Palestinian Christian land that was invaded by the Europeans. Very often, there's so many examples of even violence perpetrated onto the Palestinian Christians. Certainly Jews were killed, not only Muslims but Jews, but also at times Christians, the so-called Oriental or Eastern Christians. So from the point of view of the Muslims, this was not a war of Islam against Christianity or Christianity. They didn't see the Europeans so much in religious terms, more in terms of foreign invaders who were invading the land of Muslims, Jews, and Christians. So I think it's very important for us to understand, the differing points of views. One term, crusade, can result in our misreading how these wars were looked at by the Muslims, right? And then if you think about how the Jews looked at the Crusades, how the Eastern Christians look at the Crusades, it becomes more interesting, right? The assumption is that the Eastern Christians would have been with the Crusaders, but that wasn't true. In some instances they were, but in other instances they were not. But what we do know is that prior to the Crusades, or rather after the Crusades, the relationship between Muslims and Christians in that area, what is now called Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria, and so on, historians are divided on what exactly happened, but it seems that some degree of mistrust did develop among Muslims towards Christians because of the suspicion that in some cases anyway, Eastern Christians had sided with the Crusaders, right? So that these historical events, and the Crusades took place over about 200 years. So in the course of 200 years, you can imagine how some degree of mistrust would develop among Muslims with regard to Christians. And this idea of crusades, of invading Europeans, has stuck in the minds of certain Muslims. So for example, Al-Qaeda refers to America as the Crusaders, as a crusading people, right? Now, I'm talking about this because what I want to suggest is, on the one hand, you have these conflicts and you have mistrust. You have, over the course of hundreds of years, the development of this mistrust, exacerbated by colonialism, exacerbated by the result of Christian missionary work during the colonial period and even after, exacerbated by terrorism committed in the name of Islam by certain groups. So life, history has created a problem. But on the other hand, if you look at history, you also see part of the solution, right? And an example of that is this historical meeting between St. Francis and Sultan Malik al-Kamil. So, as I was saying earlier, what does that meeting say to us about how Muslims and Christians should be thinking about each other? Now, I'd like to suggest one way in which Muslims and Christians can think about each other and relate to each other that results from what we understand to be the attitude of St. Francis and Sultan Malik al-Kamil. At one level, we say that they understood and they felt the humanity in each other. But my question is, how do we translate that into thinking and practicing today? One way I believe we can translate it is to expand the notion of Judeo-Christian civilization. So what I mean, you're all familiar with that term, right? Judeo-Christian. For a few centuries, at least for, I would say, 200 to 300 years, Christendom, particularly in the West, and it's probably more the case in America than in Europe, thinks of itself as Judeo-Christian, right? That to the extent that the West is Christian, its civilization is not just Christian, it is Judeo-Christian. Because you have your heritage in Judaism, right? The Old Testament, the prophets of the Old Testament, and many influences of Judaism in Christianity. So this idea of the West being Judeo-Christian, and to the extent that Christianity today is defined to a large extent through the achievements of Western civilization over the last few hundred years, right? And that Western influence has an important, given its stamp on Christian civilization. There's a great deal of overlap between Western civilization and Christian civilization. So this idea of Judeo-Christian civilization plays an important role in terms of this sense of inclusivity. So inclusivity between Jews and Christians, right? But I want to argue that if Christians feel that Judaism is part of their heritage, they should also feel that Islam is part of their heritage. So we're trying to go to another level of appreciation. In other words, we're not simply saying that there are similarities in values, similarities in ideas, similarities in that there are historical cases of interaction. We're going beyond that. We're saying that in your civilization, there is Islam in your civilization, right? And we can say the same thing about Muslims. There is Christianity in our civilization. And I'd like to give you some examples of that, right? Now, some of the examples are known to you. You would have probably heard about the impact of Islamic philosophy on Christian Catholic scholasticism, right? On Catholic theology. You would have heard about the impact of scholars like Ibn Rushd, Averroes, known as Averroes in the West. So Averroes he lived during he was from Spain when Spain was was known as Al-Andalus, under Muslim rule. He was a philosopher, and there was his impact on Christian theology, on European thought, was so great that there was a school of Averroism in the West, in Europe, known as Latin Averroism, right? And he is said to have had such an impact that it played a role in the development of the Enlightenment in Europe. And there are many other examples that we can give. And in fact, these have been written about not so much by the Muslims, but by European scholars. the impact of Islamic philosophy on Thomas Aquinas is also well known. But there are also other examples from daily life, not just from philosophy. I mentioned philosophy. We can also mention mathematics. We can mention other fields, in the sciences. But we can also mention examples from daily life, which shows even more vividly how Islam is part of the civilization of Europe. Right? Now, I'm sure many of you have, I don't know about the current generation, but my generation, Singaporeans, Malaysians, we all, and I'm referring to those of you who are not Muslims, you all must have grown up with the stories of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. Am I right? Yeah. And why do we grow up with those stories? Because we were colonized by the British. Because at least in those days, every British or English or European kid grows up with these stories. Sinbad the Sailor, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. These come from the so-called Arabian Nights, right? This is already part of European civilization. These come from the Muslims, but they have become part of European civilization. And Europeans don't see these as something foreign, as something strange, right? And some items in our daily lives, like my favorite example is sherbet ice cream. You know sherbet ice cream? Yeah. So sherbet probably was introduced to the Crusaders by the Palestinians or by the Syrians, people in that area, because the word sherbet comes from the Arabic word sharbat, right? And the word syrup comes from the Arabic word sharab. So they must have what the Arabs and the Persians, actually, the Persians have a kind of architectural structure which makes it possible to keep ice cool in summer. It's called a yakhchal in Persian. So it made it possible when they brought ice from in winter, or when they managed to bring ice from mountainous areas where it was still cold down to warmer areas. They could keep it in these structures where the ice would remain ice. It would not melt, right, for a long time. So this ice would be mixed with certain sweetened, what do you call it? What we call syrup, basically, sharab, syrup, or sharbat, mixture of ice and sweetened herbs, and sugar, of course. Even the word sugar comes from Arabic. Sukar comes from Arabic, right? So if you dig a little bit, you will find so many things from Islamic tradition that are now part of Western civilization and part of Christian civilization, right? But one example that I would like to give, which is interesting, it so happens that there's a carpet there. Who brought the carpet? Or whose carpet? Whose carpet? It's yours. It's your carpet. Do you know where it's from?
Yeah, that looks like a Persian, Indian, Persian Indian.
Yeah, it says. You think Persian?
Bamboo.
Huh?
It's a bamboo weave.
Oh, really?
Not wool.
No, it's not wool. But is it Persian or?
The bamboo, I think it's Persian Indian.
Persian, yeah, okay, all right. So, how is the carpet relevant to my story? do you think it's, how could it possibly be relevant, right? You see, first of all, these carpets, these hand-woven carpets, generally come from the Muslim world, right? Iran, Turkey, to some extent, and of course some of the Central Asian republics, like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and so on. Of course, Pakistan, and different parts of India. Now, the Chinese, the Han Chinese, also weave carpets for centuries. But there's a big difference between Chinese carpets and the carpets made by Muslims. The difference is that you find Chinese carpets have a lot of empty spaces. The carpets made by Muslims tend to be very busy. Sometimes with, very often with floral or vegetal or geometric designs, and sometimes with designs that depict life. Yeah? But they're always busy. Now, why are they busy? There's this idea in Islamic, in philosophy, in theology and philosophy, in terms of the idea about the nature of reality, that there's no such thing as the void. There's no emptiness. There's no nothing. Because everything is either God or what God created. There cannot be any empty space, right? So, so a carpet like this, right? Can you see this? You see it? There's no empty space. There's no empty space there, right? So it reflects an Islamic worldview. The other thing is, many of these carpets made by Muslims are based on geometric designs. And these geometric designs symbolize the idea of infinity, right? The infinity of God. Right? It doesn't end, in other words, right? Now, how is this relevant? Because we find that in the most important structures of Christianity, you find these carpets. It's good that there's a carpet here because it proves my point, right? But in this case, this is only here temporarily, I suppose. You're not going to leave it here. You'll take it back home, right? But if we look at some pictures, could you? Can I do it myself, actually? Yeah. Okay. All right. So here you have a painting. I'm just going to show you 3 or 4 paintings from late medieval period. Here you have a painting of the Virgin and Child with St. John. And you see a carpet, right? Now these carpets are Muslim carpets, basically, right? Because by that period, it was very common to have these carpets in Turkish or Persian carpets in churches, in cathedrals, right? Of course, Bishop Ruben also has such carpets, I think, in Istanbul, right, in the church. Yes, that's right. So now, what is interesting here, because the carpet is not simply a piece of fabric that you stand on, right? Of course, there is a functional use of the carpets because in Europe, for many months of the year, it is cold, right? Even in fact, in some countries, even in summer, indoors it is quite cold. The stone floors are cold, so you need something to stand on. So there is that function. But then these carpets that are used are these carpets are not just functional; they reflect an Islamic worldview. Yet they are found in the church. To me, that's very interesting, and that's kind of dialogue going on, right? So if you have and here's another one by Lorenzo Lotto, the artist, husband and wife. Then you see a carpet on the table. Here's another one, also by the same artist, The Arms of St. Anthony, 1542. Again, you see, and you see these carpets are all prominently displayed in the paintings, right? They had a place, I think, quite an important place. And here you have Madonna and Child. Again, the carpet prominently shown there in the painting, right? Now you can find the same thing, the same idea, with a reversed logic, right? Among Muslims, you find aspects of Islamic civilization that are central to Islamic civilization, but which actually come from Christianity. For example, the dome and the arches in mosques. The dome is not traditional. In the time of the Prophet in Medina and Mecca, there were no domes. The mosque did not have domes. The Muslims derived the idea of the mosque from the Romans, from Byzantine. And in fact, in Istanbul, if you go to Istanbul, one of the oldest, most magnificent churches, the Hagia Sophia, right? When the Turks entered Istanbul, when they conquered Istanbul, they must have been so impressed and taken over by the church, taken in by the church rather. They constructed a mosque opposite the Hagia Sophia, which followed the similar design. So Ottoman era mosques, since the conquest of Istanbul, follow that design, right? The style of the domes and so on. So we will find, so my point is this, that if you look at philosophy, you look at theology, you look at literature, you look at daily life, I gave you the example of sugar and ice cream and so on. You look at, and also gave the example of the carpets, you will find that Islam is as much a part of Christian civilization as Judaism is. And that therefore Christians should think of their civilization not only in Judeo-Christian terms, but perhaps also in Judeo-Christian Islamic terms. And I would argue that Muslims have to think the same way about their own civilization, because there are so many things in Islamic civilization that come from the Jews and come from the Christians, right? So I'm saying that if St. Francis were alive today, and if he were to think about how his perception of the other, of Muslims, was to be realized, at the abstract level, he would agree that we should see the humanity in each other. But in today's world, seeing the humanity in each other, I think, means going beyond looking at similarities, but actually seeing the one in the other. In this case, seeing the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic roots of our civilization. So we're not compromising on our faiths. We're not saying we're going to dissolve the differences between Judaism and Islam and Christianity. We're not doing that. We have our respective theologies, our respective beliefs, and in some cases the beliefs are not reconcilable. So we respect that, right? But at another level, we have over centuries borrowed from each other. We have learned from each other, and we have grown as a result of that interaction. So at a civilizational level, there is a common heritage, and that, I think, is what should be stressed in our education, so that a certain level of resilience develops that makes it impossible for hate mongers and hate preachers and hate speech to affect negatively the relationship between our different religious communities. Thank you very much.